Welcome to the deep dive. When you think about ancient law, maybe you picture, I don't know, formal courts, dusty old statutes, maybe those big, famous courtroom speeches by guys like Demosthenes.
Yeah, the sort of official, polished version. And that's definitely part of the story, the legal ideal, you could say.
Exactly. But that's not the whole picture, is it? What we want to do today is get behind that facade. We want to look for the street-level experience of justice in ancient Athens.
Right. Forget just the Constitution for a moment. How did law feel on the ground? That's our mission. We're diving into the Athenian legal mindset, how they thought about it, how they lived it, and crucially, how all the arguments and frustrations actually ended up on stage, especially in comedies.
Yeah, that comedy angle is fascinating. So
Yeah.
we're pulling together different kinds of evidence, stuff about the institution, sure, but also philosophy and, like you said, popular comedy to try and understand the mechanics of Athenian justice and maybe some of the big anxieties that stirred up.
And we're setting this firmly in classical democratic Athens, because this wasn't a place where law was just for lawyers. It was woven into the fabric of being a citizen.
You couldn't avoid it, basically.
Pretty much. You need to see this whole system, especially the courts, as, I suppose, the main stage for playing out social life, political fights, everything. Because every single citizen was potentially a judge, or someone being judged, or, as we'll definitely see, someone very, very keen on suing somebody else.
Okay, so let's start with the structure itself.
Hmm.
Because to get why Athenian litigation was so intense, so personal, we need to grasp how radically different their system was. It wasn't just tweaking tradition, they really rebuilt it from the ground up.
Oh, absolutely revolutionary. And the starting point, you really have to go back to Cleisthenes and his reforms. The council he set up, the boule, wasn't just another committee, it was fundamental.
How so? What made it so different?
Well, it was explicitly designed for popular representation. Seats were distributed carefully based on the population of the different electorates, the tribes. It showed they were thinking hard about, representative government, making sure power was spread out.
So it wasn't just the old powerful families running things. They were deliberately engineering a system to bring in broader participation.
Precisely. And in day-to-day terms, this council became the real engine room of the state. They prepared the agenda for the assembly, managed finances, foreign affairs. They had a huge influence on legislation. You could almost compare it to how a modern government steers things through parliament. They set the terms of the debate.
And this seems like the really radical part. The final say didn't rest with his council, did it? The ultimate power was still with the assembly, the ecclesia.
Exactly. That's the core of the direct democracy. The council proposed things, the probulimata, but the ecclesia, where every citizen could show up, speak, and vote, held the sovereign legislative power.
That seems kind of unwieldy. How could that possibly work?
Well, it only worked because Athens was relatively small, a city-state. You couldn't do that with millions of citizens. But there, it meant the ordinary citizen, in theory and often in practice, had the ultimate veto, the final word on laws.
Okay, so that's the legislative side. But this democratic impulse went even further under Pericles, right? That's when we get what people call the consummation of the democracy.
Yes, and this is where the legal system takes a sharp turn away from anything we'd recognize. Pericles basically oversaw the systematic transfer of judicial power away from officials.
What do you mean? Away from judges?
Well, away from the magistrates, the archons, the elected or appointed officials. They were stripped of nearly all their power to judge cases. They could impose tiny fines, maybe, but that was about it.
Even traditional bodies?
Even the Areopagus. This ancient, venerable council, once incredibly powerful, lost almost all its jurisdiction. The only thing they kept was homicide cases, which had deep religious and ritual significance.
Wow. So if the officials weren't judging, who was? That must have left a huge gap. Athens was famously litigious, right?
It created a vacuum, yeah. And that vacuum was filled entirely by the people, by the decastes. These were the popular jury courts.
Popular meaning citizens.
Ordinary citizens, lots of them. Juries weren't 12 people. They were huge, 501, 1001, sometimes even more for really big political trials. And crucially, they were paid.
Ah, the payment seems key. Because that meant it wasn't just the wealthy landowners who could afford to take time off to serve on juries.
Absolutely essential. The state salary, the mistos, even though it wasn't much, meant that poorer citizens, artisans, farmers, rowers in the fleet could actually participate. It made the judiciary genuinely representative, cutting across class lines. You didn't need to be rich to hold power in the courts.
And these massive citizen juries, they weren't just deciding run-of-the-mill cases.
Oh no, they handled pretty much everything. Property disputes, assaults, commercial cases, political charges, you name it. But they also had this other incredible power they served as nomothetai.
Nomothetai? Law setters? Is that what it means?
Roughly, yeah. Enactors of laws. If someone proposed repealing an old law or bringing in a new one, it wasn't just rubber stamped by the assembly. Instead, the assembly would appoint a large panel drawn from the same pool of eligible jurors to review it.
So the jurors were also the ultimate legislative review board.
In effect, yes. These large committees, the nomothetai, had the final say on whether a law was valid or should be scrapped. Think about that. The same ordinary citizens deciding if you were guilty were also deciding if the law itself was sound. The people were sovereign, both in applying the law and in making it.
That structure, this total reliance on the mass jury, must have fundamentally shaped how people argued their cases. It also sets up this powerful ideal, doesn't it? This idea of the people as the ultimate source of justice. We even see that reflected in high culture, like tragedy.
Definitely. You look at someone like Aeschylus, writing a bit earlier. He takes these old, brutal myths, stories of family curses, endless cycles of revenge killing, like in the Orestia with Agamemnon's family. These horrors rooted in the private household, the oikos.
Where it's all about personal vengeance, an eye for an eye, generation after generation.
Exactly. Driven by what he calls the thrice-gorged demon of the family. Aeschylus takes those primal conflicts and reframes them. He finds the resolution not in more private killing, but within the public framework of the city, the polis.
The democratic city becomes the solution.
Yes. The final court that resolves Orestes' fate is the Athenian court, the Areopagus, presided over by Athena herself. The democratic polis provides the institutions, the public space, to settle these deep conflicts of obligation, even gender conflict, in a way the private feud never could. In this idealized view, the legal system is the civilizing force. It brings order out of chaos.
Okay, so we've got this picture of a highly developed, radically democratic system, theoretically designed for peace, order, popular control. But the reality seems to have been quite different when you actually stepped into the courtroom.
That's where it gets messy. Because you take that ideal, the polis bringing resolution, and you collide it with the reality of putting, say, 501 passionate, paid citizens in a room to judge their peers. The process suddenly looks less like calm legal interpretation and more like, well, high-stakes social combat.
So the idea that law stops private violence, maybe it didn't quite work like that.
Well, many scholars traditionally viewed it that way, law, as the peaceful substitute. But you can argue, looking at how the system actually functioned, that it was built on the assumption that conflict is normal. Disputes are part of life, not something weird. The courts just provided a formal public arena for fighting them out.
Less a system for eliminating conflict, more a system for managing it. Or maybe even encouraging it in a particular way.
You could definitely see it that way. It became a powerful mechanism for social control, for sorting out who was who in the social and political pecking order, because the judges were ordinary citizens, not legal professionals.
They weren't just focused on the legal technicalities.
Not primarily, no. The goal wasn't just, did person A break law B? It was more about judging the whole situation, the whole relationship between the parties involved. It was about determining who deserved the community's trust and honor.
So if I'm in court, I'm not just arguing the facts of the case. I'm basically trying to convince this massive jury that I'm a good, upstanding citizen and my opponent is, well, not.
That's the core rhetorical strategy, exactly. You had to frame your case within what scholars call the community's normative repertoire, basically. All the shared values, expectations, and ideas about what makes a good Athenian. The crucial question often boiled down to, what sort of person is this?
Meaning things we consider totally irrelevant today, like whether someone paid their fair share for festivals or served briefly in the army, or even, I suppose, their personal life that could all be brought up.
Absolutely central. The surviving court speeches are full of it. Stuff modern lawyers would object to immediately as irrelevant character evidence. Accusations about someone's lifestyle, their political leanings, personal insults, boasts about your own public service, your liturgies.
Those expensive public services the rich were expected to fund.
Right. Contributing to a worship, funding a tragic chorus. If you could show you did all that, served honorably, spoke well of the democracy you established your character, that made your argument seem more credible. Your word carried more weight.
This intense focus on character must have meant that lawsuits weren't always just about the specific issue at hand. They could become tools in ongoing rivalries, couldn't they?
Completely. A public lawsuit could easily be framed by your opponent as just another move in a private feud. It turned public justice into a weapon for personal vendettas.
Is there a good example of
The
that?
classic one is Demosthenes versus Medius. Demosthenes sued Medius, a wealthy, powerful rival, using a public charge, graphae praecious, because Medius had allegedly punched him during a religious festival, a public assault.
Okay, sounds serious.
It was. But Medius's defense, or at least part of it, could be to argue, look, this isn't really about protecting public order. This is just Demosthenes using the courts to get back at me because we're political enemies. It's just a maneuver in our private feud.
So Medius tries to downplay it, make it seem like typical political rough and tumble.
Exactly. He could argue that this kind of aggressive behavior, the verbal attacks, the posturing, maybe even the occasional scuffle was just normal, a routine part of social life for elites competing for honor, philotemia, in a very competitive, agonistic society.
Implying that Demosthenes is overreacting by bringing it to court, that he's using the law inappropriately.
Precisely. Is Medius's action an outrageous offense against the polis, as Demosthenes claims? Or is it just how ambitious men behave, and this lawsuit is simply another round in their ongoing rivalry? The jury had to decide which frame felt right.
And for Demosthenes, it wasn't just about the slap. It was about his own honor being publicly challenged.
Absolutely. He basically says he had to sue because letting the insult slide would cover him with shame. The law becomes the vehicle for restoring personal honor, but you frame it as being about the public good.
So the law wasn't this separate, objective thing. It was deeply embedded in personal honor, wealth, politics, character, all judged together in this very public, very democratic arena.
It was volatile. And because it relied so heavily on persuasion and character judgment, it was wide open to rhetorical manipulation. And the Athenians knew this. They talked about it, worried about it, even joked about it.
Which brings us to how these anxieties were reflected outside the courtroom. This gap between the ideal, the law brings order, and the reality, the court, is another battlefield people noticed. Thinkers, writers.
Oh, definitely. And a lot of the critique centered on rhetoric, on the power of language itself. The Sophists really kicked this off in the mid-5th century.
These were the traveling teachers who taught public speaking.
Yeah, for a fee. They taught ambitious young men how to craft persuasive arguments, appeal to emotions, structure speeches, and maybe most controversially, how to make the weaker argument appear stronger.
Which is exactly the skill you'd need to win in that Athenian courtroom we've been describing. They were basically training people for legal combat.
They were providing the tools demanded by the democratic system, but their arrival caused huge anxiety because it seemed like they were detaching justice from truth. Could skill alone beat virtue in court? That was the fear.
And the philosophers jumped right into this debate. You mentioned Xenophon's account of Socrates.
Right. It's interesting how Socrates tackles it. He doesn't start with some grand definition of what is justice with a capital J. He gets practical, focusing on the laws of the city.
How does he do that?
He starts by getting agreement that laws exist and that people who follow them deal as they must or as they should. He grounds it in civic obedience and the reality of the democratic state.
And then he defines the just person as
someone knowing the lawfully just things.
Yeah.
See the emphasis. Lawfully just, not just abstractly just, but just according to the laws of Athens.
Why is that distinction so important?
Because it pushes back against the Sophists, who might argue justice is relative or just a matter of opinion. Socrates ties justice directly to the authority of the polis and its democratically enacted laws. He gets his conversation partner, Euthydemus, to agree that these laws were enacted kalos, meaning nobly, beautifully, rightly.
So it's not just that the laws exist, they're good laws because the democracy made them.
That's the implication. Kalos connects the lawmaking process to civic virtue. So for Socrates here, being just means obeying these specific noble laws of Athens. It's a defense of the democratic ideal against those who might use clever arguments to undermine it. The good citizen obeys the city's laws.
A very philosophical defense. But the average Athenian wasn't necessarily reading Xenophon. They were processing these same anxieties, these fears about rhetoric and tricky lawyers through comedy, right? This is where Aristophanes comes crashing in.
Absolutely. If you want the street-level reaction, Aristophanes is your guy. His plays are just packed with satire about the legal system. That brief mention in our sources about the clouds and Socrates' thinkery, the frontisterion, that's the tip of the iceberg. But it points right at the heart of the matter.
The frontisterion in the play isn't just a school. It's portrayed as this crazy place where they teach you how to argue your way out of anything, right? Twisting logic, ignoring morality.
Exactly. It embodies all the popular fears about the Sophists and this newfangled rhetoric. The whole plot of The Clouds is driven by legal anxiety. The main character, Strepsiades, is drowning in debt. He sends his son to the frontisterians specifically to learn how to argue unfairly in court so they can cheat their creditors.
It directly stages the conflict between traditional values and this new slippery rhetoric.
Yeah.
Doesn't it have, like, the personified arguments debating each other?
Yes. The famous debate between the just stronger argument, representing old-fashioned virtue, and the unjust weaker argument, representing the tricky new sophistic rhetoric. And guess who wins in the play?
The unjust argument, through clever wordplay.
Right. It's hilarious, but it's also a sharp critique. It's saying to the audience, look what these techniques can do. They can make wrong seem right. It reflects a real public frustration that the courts, which were supposed to uphold justice based on character, seemed vulnerable to pure rhetorical skill. People laughed, but maybe nervously.
This must tie into that figure Aristophanes loves to mock, the sycophant.
Oh, constantly. The sycophant is a stock villain in his plays, and we need to be clear, this isn't a sycophant in our modern sense of a flatterer. In Athens, it meant a vexatious litigant, someone who brings lawsuits, often baseless ones, maybe hoping to extort a settlement out of court or gain politically.
So they're abusing the legal system for personal profit.
Exactly. They weaponize the democratic access to the courts. Aristophanes presents them as parasites, exploiting the system. The fear was that the very openness of the courts, combined with the power of rhetoric taught by people like the Sophists, or Socrates, as Aristophanes unfairly portrays him in Clouds, created these characters who operated within the rules but totally subverted the spirit of justice.
So comedy becomes this space to air all these frustrations about the legal system, the manipulative rhetoric, the potential for injustice, the annoying sycophants.
Precisely. It's a vital counterpoint to the formal speeches and the philosophical ideals. It shows us what people were actually complaining about over wine or in the agora.
And finally, even when the system reached its conclusion, punishment that also reflected this core Athenian ideology, didn't it?
Yes, the punishment system was deeply tied to their ideas about citizenship. It was based on this notion of a reciprocal relationship between city and citizen. The city grants you rights and privileges, the right to vote, speak, use the courts, hold office. In return, you owe the city duties military service, paying taxes or funding liturgies, obeying the laws.
So if you break that deal, if you fail in your duties,
then the logical punishment is to lose the privileges. For major breaches of civic duty, the classic example is a soldier deserting his post, a fundamental betrayal of the policity. The characteristic Athenian punishment wasn't necessarily death or torture, it was atimia.
which means dishonor, but it was much more concrete than that, wasn't it?
Much more. Atimia was essentially civic death. If you were declared atimos, you lost your political rights. You couldn't vote, couldn't speak in the assembly, couldn't hold office, couldn't go to certain public places. And critically, you couldn't use the courts yourself. You lost your legal standing.
Wow. So you become a non-person in the political and legal life of the city?
Exactly. Demosthenes says the deserter deserves atimia, deserves to be stripped of his share in our common privileges. It reinforces the whole ideology. Fail your civic duty, and you forfeit your place in the civic community. It's a punishment that makes perfect sense within their specific democratic framework.
And they actually saw this as moderate compared to others.
Relatively speaking, yes. Compared to, say, the Spartans, who apparently used harsher forms of public shaming and physical punishment, the Athenians saw atimia as fitting for a democracy. Political exclusion was, in many ways, the ultimate penalty for failing the political community.
So pulling all these threads together, the radical democratic structure, the messy reality, the courtroom feuds, the philosophical worries about rhetoric, and the sharp satire in comedy. What's the big picture?
The big picture is this fascinating, maybe unavoidable tension. On one hand, you have Athenian law built on this incredibly high-minded principle of popular sovereignty, the people as the ultimate judge.
The ideal we saw in Aeschylus.
Right. But in practice, the system created courts that were incredibly personal, political, and rhetorical. Places where your social standing, your network, your ability to perform character, and yeah, your skill in argument often mattered as much, or maybe even more, than the strict letter of the law. Citizens were constantly navigating between that lawfully just ideal Socrates talked about and the sometimes ugly reality of winning through persuasion, even sophistry.
And the sources outside the formal legal text, like Aristophanes, are so valuable because they show us the Athenians weren't blind to this. They saw the problems, the contradictions.
They were actively wrestling with it. They recognized the sycophant, they laughed and worried about the frontisterian, they understood that a smooth talker could potentially twist justice. The whole city was caught up in this ongoing, very public debate about what justice really meant in their democracy.
It wasn't just an academic question, it was lived reality.
Every time they walked into court, potentially.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, the listener, to take away. Think about this. The Athenian system put massive legal and legislative power into the hands of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of ordinary, paid citizens who judged not just the facts, but the person. Every major case became, essentially, a public evaluation of character and belonging.
Imagine if our legal system worked like that today. If every significant trial wasn't just about guilt or innocence based on evidence, but was also fundamentally a community judgment on whether the people involved deserved honor, trust, and a place in society.
How different would our concept of justice be if the consequence for failing your community wasn't just prison, but potentially losing your voice, your standing, your athenia?
How might that change how we think about civic responsibility?
Definitely something to think about. Join us next time for another deep dive.